What's up YouTube, it's Ravlar here and welcome back to another video. So yesterday we reviewed Mutated Flurry and that video went down very well, so if you haven't checked that out yet, please make sure you do. And today we're going to be reviewing Mutated Flurry. So sit back, relax and enjoy the video, but before we get into it, just a quick self-plug. Make sure you follow me on Twitch because I stream a lot and yesterday's stream was absolutely lit, so I'd love to see you guys as part of it. Of course, feel free to follow me on Twitter and please do subscribe down below, it does mean a lot. But anyway, guys, girls and Apache helicopters, let's get right on with today's video. So first things first, to get some context into the buff to Mutated Flurry, let's take a look at the original version. So Flurry is a dual wield ability, meaning that you cannot use it if you're using two-handed melee. It consists of 4 attacks, each dealing 94% damage each, and it is an area of effect ability. So normal Flurry is a very weak ability and it should pretty much not be used in any circumstances. There are a couple of niches, maybe if you're using Quake and Hurricane and you're looking for a third AoE ability, you could use it, but basically it's trash, and that is most likely why they decided to release a mutated variant of the ability. Now let's talk about Mutated Flurry. So when it comes to AoE damage, it's pretty much the same as normal Flurry, but when you're one-on-one with a target, the damage increases from 94% weapon damage per hit to 157% weapon damage per hit, making it a reasonably strong threshold if used properly. Now, the additional buff that Mutated Flurry gives is that for each hit that lands, it reduces the Zerk cooldown by 1.2 seconds up to a maximum of 4.8 seconds. Now it's important that we understand this because I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, Mutated Flurry is awesome because you can just AoE and get Zerk back instantly. No, it's really important to note the maximum amount of Zerk cooldown you can get is 4.8 seconds. So just keep that in mind when we go through the video. So firstly, let's look at Mutated Flurry as an ability on a one-on-one target. Now, what's really interesting is that Mutated Flurry, if cancelled on global cooldown, actually becomes quite a strong threshold. So what I mean by this is we don't let all of the hits of Mutated Flurry land, but instead we cancel it as soon as global cooldown hits by starting another ability, and the second hit of Mutated Flurry will stack, so you get 2 hits of Mutated Flurry and it looks something a bit like this. So how good is it on a one-on-one target? Well, if cancelled properly, it becomes a stronger threshold than a forceful backhand. Now a forceful backhand with flanking 3 does up to 245% weapon damage in 1 hit, and Mutated Flurry, if cancelled correctly, 2 hits of Mutated Flurry land and hence it does 314% weapon damage. Now that's all well and good, but putting it into context of a Zerk rotation with an adrenaline pot, you normally assault, then destroy, and normally with some basic impatient perk procs, you're able to use a forceful backhand as a third threshold as your last ability before Zerk runs out. So earlier we established that Mutated Flurry is a higher damaging threshold than forceful backhand, but it's a bit complicated because normally you only have enough time for 1 hit of Mutated Flurry to actually be within the Zerk countdown, and the second hit just doesn't get the Zerk buff because Zerk is over by that time. With that being said, however, you may get very lucky with impatient procs, and you may get an Asylum Surgeon drink proc on Assault or Destroy, and if that's the case, definitely use Mutated Flurry instead of forceful backhand. One tiny note on that, if you're facing a boss with high defense which you're splashing on constantly, you may be better off using Quake as a third threshold because it reduces affinity by 2, but that depends completely on the scenario, so we're not going to get into that. So now we've looked at the buffed ability damage of the ability, it's time to turn our attention to the additional buff which reduces the Zerk cooldown by a maximum of 4.8 seconds. So, your typical melee rotation, if you have a ZGS, looks something like this. You build from 0 to 100% adrenaline using basics, you use your Zerk and then a pot, and continue with your Zerk rotation, which allows you normally to get 3 thresholds off. After this, you normally build with basics to get to around 95% adrenaline, and then you use your ZGS spec, and within your ZGS spec you get the 50% damage buff, and you're able to use Assault and Destroy within that time. You could actually use a third threshold, but the adrenaline gain and the time used from actually performing that threshold, even if it's Mutated Flurry, is simply not worth it because it delays the time that you can get to Zerk. And after that you build to 100% adrenaline and do a Zerk rotation again, this time without an APOP. So that's what a typical melee rotation with a ZGS looks like. And the issue is that the only potential place where Mutated Flurry could even fit into that rotation is as the third threshold in your Zerk rotation with an adrenaline pop, and we know that if we want to get the most damage out of the ability, we need to cancel it as soon as global cooldown hits, and that means we only get 2 hits in there, so that only reduces the Zerk cooldown by 2.4 seconds, which is pretty much one ability anyway. Now there is perhaps a case that you actually replace Destroy with Mutated Flurry when you're in your ZGS spec, but personally I don't think that it's worth it because the damage from Destroy will probably outweigh the additional damage you'd get from having Zerk off cooldown a tiny bit quicker, but then again I'm no ability maths guru, so don't quote me on that. Overall, the damage buff from Mutated Flurry, if you have a ZGS and do a correct rotation, I really don't think it's that much at all. You probably won't even notice it, so yeah, kind of meh in this regard. But let's have a look at the rotation without a ZGS. So normally you just build from 0 to 100 using basics, then you do a Zerk with an adrenaline pop, and then you pop 2 or 3 thresholds. You would then move on to do your non-Zerk melee rotation and then move on to your Zerk rotation without the adren pop. Now if you don't know what a good melee rotation looks like, yet again I've linked the June song in the top right, he has covered it all pretty much, so that will definitely help you get some context to what we're talking about here. But anyway, because we don't have a ZGS, you should have a lot of adrenaline between your first Zerk and your second Zerk, and in that time there is definitely time to get off a Mutated Flurry, which is going to be very useful in this scenario because we want to get to Zerk as quickly as possible because we don't have a ZGS to buff our attacks. Now personally, if I didn't have a ZGS, I would always put Mutated Flurry as my third threshold in my Zerk rotation, and I would completely disregard the fact that Forceful Backhand even exists, and I would actually let Mutated Flurry do all 4 hits because we want to get to Zerk as quickly as possible. Logically to me that seems like the ideal place to put it, but I may be wrong, so feel free to correct me down in the comments. In terms of overall output, I think it's fair to say that with a ZGS, it doesn't really affect things too much. You may get to Zerk maybe an ability quicker, but overall not that significant. Where it does become slightly more significant is if you don't have a ZGS. Now another scenario where Mutated Flurry could be slightly useful is if you're tryharding at Slayer. And I say this because normally when you do melee Slayer you're using a scythe or a lance and you're trying to AoE mobs as quickly as possible. So if you do want to use Mutated Flurry there, you will need to bring a dual wield switch, which for Revo and Chill is not ideal. But if you do want to add the manual input to switching to dual wield, I imagine it would be something like you use your 2H weapon to Quake and Hurricane, and then you would switch to your dual wield and then use Flurry, which is actually still an AoE ability, so it's not actually worthless, but it's effort and it's quite annoying, and then you can have your Zerk cooldown slightly faster. But for me that sounds like a bit too try-hard for Slayer because I like to Revo and Chill during my Slayer time, but if you want to use it, all power to you. So we really covered a lot this video on Mutated Flurry, but is it worth it? Well, let's have a look at its pros and cons, and you guys can decide at the end of the day. So pros, I think it's a nice DPS increase if you don't have a ZGS. Also, it is quite a powerful threshold ability which you can take advantage of if you're in a Zerk and you get lots of Asylum Surge and Ring procs or Impatient procs, and it's strong enough in most cases to outclass Forceful Backhand with Flanking 3. To add to this, Mutated Flurry is awesome because we don't rely on the target facing the other way like we do with Forceful Backhand, and this actually gives us a lot more flexibility to increase our DPS in scenarios where that is not applicable. Finally, it does have a use in Slayer if you're willing to put in the extra effort and you don't own a ZGS. That's it for the pros, let's move on to the cons. Now my first major concern with this ability is that it's very limited in where you can use it. Now let me explain what I mean. So, for example, in God Wars Dungeon 2 PVM, most of the time you only do one Zerk rotation before the boss is dead. So, basically, because the fight wasn't long enough, we don't even get to see the benefit of using Mutated Flurry in terms of having a reduced Zerk cooldown. Now, by the time the boss dies and respawns, your Zerk will 99% of the time be off cooldown again, so you really had no benefit of using Mutated Flurry other than the ability damage it does. So overall, I think it's fair to say that this limits Mutated Flurry's utility to bosses where you're engaged in combat for a continuous piece of time, like maybe Araxor, Virago, Yakamaru, etc. Now the second major issue with Mutated Flurry is that it barely increases your DPS if you have a ZGS. Basically, the ZGS spec takes priority over Mutated Flurry, and as a result, it doesn't increase your DPS all that much. Even if we replace Forceful Backhand with Mutated Flurry, it's still not that significant, and you probably won't even notice it in the long run. Another problem with Mutated Flurry is the fact that it is only a dual wield ability, therefore if you have two-handed melee and you don't bring a switch, you won't benefit from Flurry whatsoever, so it really restricts its utility in that way as well. So the final couple of cons, well basically if you want to get the maximum damage output from Mutated Flurry you need to cancel it manually, which some people don't like to do, and of course it is quite expensive, 50 mil is hardly cheap. So my personal overall verdict on this ability is that if you have a ZGS, it's not going to be that useful, but if you have some spare cash lying around, then by all means go ahead and buy it, because it definitely is quite nice to not rely on flanking 3 for the third threshold. And if you don't have a ZGS, personally I feel that 50 mil is a bit too expensive for this ability, but it's still early days. I reckon it will probably settle at around 20 mil in the long term. At which point, if you don't have a ZGS, I think it will be a worthwhile purchase, but that's just my opinion. By all means, you are entitled to your own, and if you want to share it down below, please do so, because I'd love to hear it. So anyway guys, that about wraps it up. Making that video was very tough and time consuming, so if you do leave a like, I would be very grateful. And I have to give a shout out to Mr. Mango, Night Eyes, Sipe, Botnuke, and LC4, who all supported me through this process by either lending me money to buy the ability or helping me figure out what to say. So thank you very much to them, and thank you very much to every single one of you watching. Please make sure to follow me on all my social media, and guys, I'll see you very soon with the Mutated Barge review. To the outro. Na 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 na.